Søren Kierkegaard heavily influenced Jacques Ellul's work. So like Kierkegaard, Ellul has been criticized for a hyper-focus on the individual and an apparent lack of interest in communities, institutions, and societies. But as it is for Kierkegaard, so it is for Ellul. Appearances can be deceptive. Both thinkers focus on the status of the individual within communities, institutions, and societies that erode and eliminate individuals. In fact, as Ellul writes in Technological Society, quote, "A prodigious upheaval took place between 1850 and 1914, which convinced everyone of the excellence of a technical movement that could produce such marvels and alter human life. All this," Marx explained, "presaged even better things and pointed to the road to follow. Fact and theory were for once in agreement. How could opinion resist? Drawn by self-interest, the ideal of comfort, for instance, the masses went over to the side of technique. Society was converted. A common will developed to exploit the possibilities of technique to the maximum, and groups of the most conflicting interests, state and individual, bourgeois and working class, united to hymn its praises. Literally everyone agreed on its excellence. True, after 1914, certain criticisms came from the intellectuals, but these were ineffective because they were usually beside the point, manifestations of vague idealism or sentimental humanitarianism. In the middle of the 19th century, when technique had hardly begun to develop, a voice was raised in prophetic warning against it. The voice was Kierkegaard's, but his warnings, solidly thought out though they were, and in the strongest sense of the word prophetic, were not heeded, for very different reasons. They were too close to the truth." That's the end of the quote. In other words, as much as Kierkegaard and Ellul appear to be antisocial individualists, it's much more accurate to say that they're trying to inspire people to become aware of and resistant to communities, institutions, or societies that devalue people. For these reasons, I was excited to speak with Kierkegaard scholar Keith Dow in the conversation that's ahead. Keith works at a unique intersection of the academic, not-for-profit, and local church worlds, an intersection that, as you'll discover, brings him into relationship with people who have intellectual and developmental disabilities. So we spend a lot of time speaking about these worlds, how they do and don't intersect, and what these intersections or lack thereof mean for the status of individuals, communities, institutions, and societies today. So with that in view, while the word disability does not appear in Kierkegaard or Ellul's work in evident or significant ways, this conversation explores how attentive considerations of what most people call disability are enriched by Kierkegaard and Ellul's work. And so with that said, here's my conversation with Keith. Welcome, Keith. It's really awesome to have you here.
Thanks, Michael. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for making time to have this conversation with me. So, as I normally do, I just want to start very simply and ask a little bit about who you are so people can get to know you. So tell us a little bit about Keith Dow. What do we need to know about Keith?
Oh, that is the big question, right? Who am I? Where to start? I guess I'll start at the beginning. I was born in Brazzaville, Congo. My parents were missionaries there with Christian Blind Mission International.
Hmm.
And so I kind of grew up in this ministry context, came back to Canada early on, about when I was about a year and a half old. And so growing up, I always kind of wrestled through. My dad was a minister and kind of wrestling through some of those dynamics of what it looked like for him to care for his congregation, what it looked like to be in a family that way, and to kind of negotiate between those priorities and the priorities of the family and figuring out where I fit in all that. Very ecumenical denominationally growing up, and so he was a United Church pastor, but spent some time in Baptist churches and more Pentecostal and charismatic churches. Was a Presbyterian youth pastor for a while. Went to Plymouth Brethren Church for several years, and an interdenominational Briarcrest College and Seminary in Saskatchewan. And now I'm credentialed as an Anabaptist pastor with Be in Christ. And so living here south of Ottawa, Ontario, my family, a wife and three kids, and serving with Caris Disability Services. So I've been here for 18 years now, I guess, and about 14 of those in the role of Manager of Organizational and Spiritual Life, which is a confusing title, but basically, I work with some of the organizational culture aspects of who we are as a Christian faith-based organization, and then also with the spiritual life side of things. So supporting people through grief and death and dying, those sorts of things, and supporting staff teams as well, compassion fatigue, and then also churches around accessibility and inclusion and fostering belonging in spaces. So it's quite a range.
Yeah, I have a very similar mixed denominational background, and even like, of course, I wasn't a missionary kid. I'm not a missionary kid, but I grew up with parents with similar like social engagement and justice inclinations. And so I think as I'm listening to you, I'm realizing why it is that we're friends.
Yeah, yeah.
And
There's a
why
lot of
we've landed in very, very similar uh integrated sort of vocational roles where it's like we're, in academia, but we're also in the not-for-profit world. I'm like,
yeah.
oh, this hearing your your origin story explains so much.
Messed up in the
Uh
same ways, right?
yes, and in mostly good ways,
Yeah,
actually.
nice.
Like I'm thankful for that background for the most part. Like yeah, I think it's a gift, right? Like because it teaches you to not think in a very sort of like narrow focused way, but sort of work with the best of each of the traditions that it offers with a view to like care for people. I mean, I don't see a lot problematic about that, but there are some people who like, oh, you didn't grow up in this church. Like,
Yeah.
anyway, this isn't Michael's origin story. This is about Keith. Okay. So you when we initially connected, it was through sort of mutual friends and colleagues, and we talked about our mutual interest, and we sort of asked the regular question that's asked, in these types of groups is, how did you end up in the area of disability? And, what part of your story makes you invested in this world? And then, for scholars, it's like, what have you written on this? And so you and I kind of talked at that point about your work with Kierkegaard and my work with Ellul and Virilio. And I said, I've written and presented on this topic before, but to date, like a lot of the work that I have done has been more so looking at like the social structures that create a world in which people who are vulnerable, including people with disabilities, are sort of forgotten, pushed to the margins, and harmed, right? And you said, yeah, kind of me too at that point. You said, I'm working with Kierkegaard and working with similar types of themes. But you just published a book that is kind of your first work that's explicitly looking at the area of personhood limits, what someone called disability. And then, of course, you've ended up where you are at Keras. So this is a long form way of asking the question is, how does a missionary kid who studied philosophy, particularly Kierkegaard, end up where you end up? And you actually talk about this in the book, which is really helpful. But I think it would be good for you to share about that, just so people know, how does one end up in this world, and how does God like bring people here and keep them there? I think that's really important to frame the rest of our conversation.
Yeah, that's a great question. And as well, I think a great um, way to frame that or to set that up in terms of talking about the many different influences on our lives and the kind of convergence that happens there. And I think we can have the approach of trying to control our lives and trying to say, this is my path, this is what I'm going for, just focusing on one thing. I'm going to be an expert, I'm going to be a doctor, lawyer, whatever it is, and just set our sights on that. Or we can kind of find a combination in tension with, I'm also going to be open to what life brings my way and what life throws at me. And I think probably for us, having a kind of mixed background and connecting with a number of different areas and denominations and those types of things, we almost have no choice but to receive things as they come. And I think that's been a beautiful convergence in my life. And so you touched on this. My background, my undergrad and my master's were in philosophy. Went to a little Dominican University college here in Ottawa and got to study under Dominican Dominican brothers. It was a beautiful experience. And I love philosophy, and I kind of saw myself as maybe that's the path that I'm headed on. And I enjoyed learning about all areas of philosophy, especially ethics. But I found that a lot of ethical thought was up here. It was very transcendent. It was very theoretical, and it was difficult to see how that related to the actual living of life as one must do. And so when I came across Kierkegaard, he seems like he really put his finger not only on that, but also the connection and the role of God, I guess, in orchestrating kind of the direction that we're headed. And so when I arrived at Kierkegaard, I kind of said, yeah, he's on to something here that makes a lot of sense for me and where I'm at, and that ethics can't just be something that you talk about and wrestle with, but it has to be something that's lived. And I think we can talk more about this in terms of what subjective truth means and objective truth and how that relates to us as Christians. But in that moment, in that instance, it was like, okay, so I almost need to do this dance throughout my life of studying, learning, having we have access to all these great thinkers, but also then how do we live that out in our life? And also as a philosophy student, I needed a job, and they weren't gonna. At that time, I was doing my bachelor in philosophy. They weren't gonna hand a bachelor in philosophy a teaching position, and so I had a friend, Jill Black, who came to me. She was part of the church we attended. She said, "Hey, Keith, I think you would be really good at working in this field with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities." And for many of us, and I would say that this is intentional by design in the ways that institutions kind of run. People with disabilities are often segregated and separated, and we're working to overcome that. But I had not encountered many folks with disabilities, particularly intellectual and developmental disabilities in my life. And so when she said this, it was kind of like this revelation. Hey, that's somewhere I could work. Hey, that's somewhere that I can make a difference. Hey, that's somewhere that I could apply some of these things that I've been learning, or at least wrestle through them, right? In terms of asking, how do we do good for the world around us, and specifically for our neighbor? So I applied with Christian Horizons at the time, now Caris Disability Services, and started working in direct support. And then kind of through the course of life, there's a role that came up that combined more of the direct support work and thinking about what it means to be a Christian faith-based organization, more of a pastoral support. And so again, somebody recognized that in me. I think we need those people around us to call that out in us because we might not see it in ourselves. And I think if I had just been in a direct support role, which is a meaningful role for sure, but if I had been in that role for a long time, I probably would have looked for other ways to engage um, my thirst for knowledge or whatever you want to call it. But this new role kind of helped to combine that pastoral and theological and philosophical side with ministering to people in the sense of employees in the care environment or people with disabilities themselves. And that's the role that I've been in ever since. I think your question was maybe more around what brought me to the book. And so I had the opportunity through that to attend some conferences, the Institute on Theology and Disability, and met Hans Reinders, who's a great theological ethicist. And it happened that at the time they were looking for PhD students to be bringing some of these things together. And so I wrote my dissertation, and that's what kind of led to the book.
There's a lot there, and I do want to dig in more to the book, what prompted you to write it, and the themes that you're working through. But before that, I want to actually explore a little bit more that one of the words that's used often in the literature and just in the stories that people tell is conversion language to describe what it's like going from your original conversion as a Christian, the hour that you believed or however many hours it took for you to confess Jesus as Lord and want to follow him, to the type of experience one goes when they are brought into relationship with somebody who has a condition that would be described as a disability
Mm,
normally. Because I just want to acknowledge and flag that there's different language used to describe what most people call disability, and for the sake of clarity, we'll just use that term here. But whether you're brought into contact because a family member is born with a disability, or you acquire a disability, or you make a friend who has a
mm,
disability, or you grow up in a context where your parents work in that area. um, People who are brought into those realities and relationships often say, there's a moment or moments where I went deeper in my understanding of Jesus because of these relationships. And once that happened, there was sort of no looking back, right? And so um I feel like you touch on it, but I do want to hear a little bit more, if you can speak to it. Is at what point in your journey as graduating as a philosophy student and just looking for a job and saying, actually, I think I could do this, and I think it's an opportunity to actually put into practice the things that I've been exploring. At what point did you have that uh experience that I'm talking about? Or maybe it was points, or maybe it's a gradual thing, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about that from you.
yeah, absolutely. Uh, And so, as I think about those early days, I'm probably overly self-reflective, and this book reveals that as well. But
Well,
as I think,
you're in good company.
so if you'll indulge me for a
Yeah,
moment,
I will.
uh,
This is your time, Keith. I'm just trying to foster the
I love it. I
self-reflection.
love it.
Yeah.
Foster and Abel is great. So as I think about those early days, I really do wrestle through that experience because, and I do in the book as well, when I talk about being called to versus being called by. And so the sense of being called to is that as I was studying philosophy from a Christian perspective, I was like, God wants us to do something with what we learn, right? That God wants us to impact our world and live this out, not only study it. And what does that look like for me, right? And so along these kind of breadcrumbs and the encouragement of Jill and others, I felt this real calling to almost as sending out, right? To work with people with disabilities. I realize that's not everybody's experience, as you were saying, that everybody has a different experience. And for some folks, they might be born almost into relation with somebody with a disability, a sibling or what have you, or it might be given a child with a disability, right? And from the very start, that's almost this experience of being called by, that you are immediately in relation with the person. If you think of that relationship with God, a relationship with your neighbor, right? It's almost being thrown into that encounter with your neighbor in a new way. Uh, but I think the called to also comes into that relationship, and that certainly did for me in the early days in the group home setting. And I worked in a space where people had different kinds of challenges, but there were um, a lot of behavioral encounters, I would say, that people would look at as quite negative. And obviously that's going to come out of a variety of places. People might be in pain or just kind of wrestling through or trying to communicate something that they need. But it was a shock to my system, right? Uh, when you have to be prepared for those encounters to become physically dangerous at times. And as you're getting to know people who think in such a variety of different ways. And it was a disruption. I think whenever we're faced with a disruption, we there's almost this rift in the ways that we've been living before that forces us into this openness where we have to figure out what to do with what we're presented with. And you realize that in the midst of those spaces, in the midst of working with these, it was five guys in the group home that I was supporting. you realize that God's image is there and alive and living beautifully in and through even some tough interactions, uh, and so you realize how small or how narrow maybe your view of God's people has been up until that point. And so that was definitely transformative for me in the sense of, and you see it in so much writing, uh, where humanity for people is just this kind of narrow. The people I have known, I'm going to assume this works for everybody, right? So a certain amount of rationality, expecting the ways people will think in this way or that way, and you just realize how wide and how vast and how beautiful, how diverse God's image and presence is in the communities around us, right? And that was kind of my awakening moment, if you will, or conversion period
Yeah.
of time.
Yeah. Yeah, as you're talking, I'm reminded actually of what Alula shared about his journey working specifically with disenfranchised youth. Different different people group, for sure, but his accounts of that sound very, very similar. Not that I'm feeling the need to project Alula's story onto yours or vice versa, but um, of course, Ellul was heavily influenced by Karl Marx, Karl Barth, and Kierkegaard. He liked Marx's method. He loved Barth's way of doing theology, but Kierkegaard was kind of the meeting of those two things and so much more for him. He kind of went on record saying, pretty much everybody I read, I say yes, but with Kierkegaard, I just sit down and listen.
Mhm.
And the way those influences coalesce in his life is he talks about working with these youth that were just treated as you know um deviant and just useless to society and dangerous and such. And he said it really shaped my theology. Like, number one, when you're talking to these youth about who God is and how God loves them and so on, he's like, I had to really think seriously about how I spoke to them. Being a professor at University of Bordeaux and being an accomplished theologian and all that, it's like you want to use the big words and whatever. And he's like, no, that has to go. And also, it's so much more about what I do, not what I say. And then even more practically, the types of ethical situations he found himself in and how it really shaped his ethics, not in the direction of like idealism, right, or
Right.
transcendentalism or pragmatism, but this kind of like Kierkegaardian of like God gets to us through in-breaking moments of people doing or saying things that totally shatter all the elegant, theoretical systems we build for
Hmm.
ethics. And that's what I really like about what you're doing as a whole in your work. But in this book, is you're saying like, okay, there's all these ways we think about preparing people for vocational caring roles. Uh, Here's what we say that we're doing, but how much does that bear up under scrutiny when you're actually in the mix of care, right? And preparing for that which you can't foresee. Can you sort of give us your like, okay, this is what where the idea for the book started, and this is kind of how I describe what I'm trying to do there.
Sure. So I'm going to go back to my master's work actually. So it was on Kierkegaard. I was writing the thesis on, and the title was Kierkegaard's Ethic, the Other by Faith. And in that, I'm wrestling through sickness unto death, works of love, fear and trembling, in conversations with Buber and um, Derrida and some others, and some of the critiques and kind of wrestling through that. And Kierkegaard is often known as kind of an individualist, right? But then you read works of love and you're like, this doesn't make a lot of sense. And it seems like he's aspirational about community, that he sets the pieces in places, but doesn't spell out how that would actually look. Because that idea of being before God and answering to God and having that as the primary kind of compass point is his priority. And I think in a lot of ways that he's right, that that needs to be the starting point. And you could live in that world forever and kind of live into helping people along that line. I kind of got to the point where I wanted to spell it out even more, right? So I had connected some of the dots and said, in works of love, here's what community could potentially look like. But I wanted to get into it with Emmanuel Levinas and kind of the face of the other and how does that actually work itself out. And give it a few years, and then I was in this field and had this opportunity to do a theology PhD, and was also thinking through disability theology and what does this mean for who we are as people, how we understand rationality, how we understand things that are important. And there was this neat overlap or sharpening almost that for Kierkegaard, the objective truth is not the primary truth, right? Now maybe throw in this quote here, and so in his journals he writes, "The thing to understand myself, to see what God really wishes me to do. The thing is to find a truth which is true for me, to find an idea for which I can live and die." And so it's a fairly well-known Kierkegaardian quote. He goes on to talk about like what's the use of discovering all this objective truth, whether it's working through the systems of philosophy, or theory of the state, or what have you, all these kinds of systems. What good would it be? Um, what good would it do me if truth stood there before me, cold and naked, not caring whether I recognized her or not, and producing me a shudder of fear rather than a trusting devotion? I certainly do not deny that I still recognize an imperative of understanding. So he doesn't deny understanding or even that it's possible, and that through it one can work upon men, but it must be taken up into my life, and that is what I now recognize as the most important thing. And so this is subjective truth, and kind of the relation with objective truth is something that Kierkegaard is well known for. But the overlap is in that working alongside people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, where systems of objective truth are maybe not accessible to them, or they're maybe not able to communicate that in the same way. You actually don't have access to the same kind of realms of cognitive hubris, if you want to call it that,
Mhm.
right? And so that just reinforces uh, how do we come up, how do we live into this world in an ethical way, live with our neighbor in an ethical way that isn't dependent upon all of these systems of thought, right? And not that it's not that you need to know all of this in order to act well. I was working with, I was supporting people who were wonderful people who were acting in a good way often, and they didn't know all these systems of philosophy, right? And so it can't be based on intellectual merit. And often it's not. You see that in a study of professors, and this would have been a while ago now, that the ethics professors were the most likely to like steal a pencil, or they had some weird metric, right? And I mean, it just illustrates the truth that knowing about things does not necessarily help you to live well into them. And so as I was thinking about these worlds coming together, I thought, yeah, that is a really excellent way to pursue the dissertation and to write about Kierkegaard's sense of community, but in the context of this work that I'm doing, in the context of what does that look like in the midst of supporting somebody through personal care, or supporting somebody in a challenging situation that they might be in. And it helped to make sense of some of those experiences for myself. And as well, when you're thinking about theology, when you're thinking about what it means to be created in God's image, it doesn't hold a lot of water if it doesn't impact the way we live our lives, right? And so I think that's what was so helpful for me, is that theology gave me some, and philosophy gave me some tools to be able to think about this very human experience in a new way, and hopefully in a way that helps others as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that provides a really helpful backdrop It almost makes me want to reread your book with that in mind. And I get resonances of Luther there and what Luther does with active passive righteousness, right? And of course, Ephesians, like God has prepared the good works for us to do beforehand. So the things that we ought to do are held out to us, and uh, the question then is, are we receiving those works from God, and how do we discern those works, and how do we reach out and take them? So it's not okay. Get your head up into the Platonic realm of ideals, and figure out how that works its way out, or just be on the ground and sort of sort your way through and figure out the most effective, way possible to move through. But how does this holy other God, who comes to us, of course, as the incarnate Word, but also uh, reveals God's self through creation and creatures, and how do those things and people lay claim to us,
Right.
and those are the people and uh, things that God uses to prompt us to take that right action. And so bringing this into your specific world is such a fascinating and rich way to concretize that. And the reality is we started talking about conversion experiences, but I often say, there are people who are on the precipice of that experience, but they turn away.
Hmm.
You're brought into encounter in some way, and it doesn't have to be someone with a disability. It could be anyone that you consider other or have othered. At that moment, once you start to form the relationship and any preconceived notion you had starts to be challenged, and then, once that's being challenged, how is God wanting to get to you through that and transform you? You got two options. You either go deeper into that, which I actually think is discipleship, or you harden your heart and walk away, and you do everything that you can to avoid it. And of course, for Kierkegaard and for Michael and Keith, it's like, take the leap of faith, jump in. God's there, is going to catch you, and like watch what happens. But we're scared, right? And so, yeah, I think this puts us in the territory of vocation and calling and profession, and kind of what you said. It's not just, an individual being called, in this sort of like empty vacuum. It's always a call extended to us in the theater of creation with people in particular ways, and therefore it's definitely not the like commodified self-help version that we're often sold on this. So can you parse out the differences that you're drawing between calling profession and vocation, and the strengths and weaknesses of how we tend to think about those things? Because I feel like you start there in your book, and I think it's really helpful to sort of ground the rest of the work that you're doing in your book.
Sure, I'm happy to chat about that. So I spoke to being called to and being called by another, and
Hmm.
I do see that as running in parallel with loving God and loving your neighbor. And those things are really one and the same at the end of the day, right? Whether you find yourself, and not to get Heideggerian, but like thrown into the situation of
Hmm.
being called by somebody, you're confronted. You talked about being confronted, right? It's a lot more difficult to walk away from somebody who is your child, the difficulty of being kind of that encounter, than it is to say, no, I'm not going to take that job, right? And so. And interestingly, on the first day that I was hired, I think there were three of us, and we were brought into this home, and we saw some of the difficulties of the people that we were working with. And one person I never saw again, right? They were just gone. The first day was enough for them. They're like, I'm out of here. Um, so I want to start by acknowledging the difference between where we find ourselves and really the privilege it is for many of us in Canadian society to just opt out. And maybe I'll problematize privilege because it's really unfortunate that we have that quote unquote privilege. Um, My family and I served with refugee claimants for about a year and a half. We lived in a home with them. And we often, this is the same message that direct support professionals often receive. We often had people come up to us and say, "Oh, that's so wonderful what you're doing. Like, I can't believe you're doing this work. Oh, I could never do that." Right? That was
Mm-hmm,
always
hmm.
the thing people say. I could never do that. And and you just want to kind of shake them a bit and say, yes, yes, you can. Like, there's nothing special about us. And in fact, the more people opt out, the more people say, no, I can't do that, or that's too high a calling, I guess if you want to use that language, then the harder it is for people who are actually working in that field, the harder it is for families and caregivers, but that don't have a choice about it, right? And we know that families and parents, caregivers often get that same kind of thing. Like you must be so special that God has. I have a hard time even saying
Yeah.
it because I know it's probably because for people who have heard this, it's almost too hard to hear, right? God must have a special kind of calling for you. When for many people, you're just struggling to get through the next day, and sometimes it feels like the support isn't there, partly because people don't see themselves as called to that work. So there's
Hmm.
that side of it that I definitely want to acknowledge. But then for people in my role, for many parents and caregivers that I've talked to as well, there is this sense of calling and vocation, and so you don't want to turn that into too big a thing that it becomes onerous, that it becomes exclusive, right? But you do need to acknowledge that it's a thing. And I think there's also the possibility of going the other way. And in many kind of secular social services, there's not a space for that. There's not a space to talk about the spirituality of caregiving. And even if you're just working with human beings coming together and experiencing mutual care in different ways, right? Obviously, the support that the direct support professional provides is going to be different from what they receive in return from the other person. But there is a sense of mutual care. There is a sense of this is significant. There's something meaningful happening here. And so I think calling and or vocation and profession start to get into some of the spiritual language that can be helpful. It doesn't mean that we just adopt them and incorporate them as is, but I think they're really helpful to think through, starting with the original kind of religious undertones, right? When you think of vocation to be called by God to a work, originally being the priesthood, perhaps, or profession, making a profession of faith, which then became associated with a profession of a certain code of ethics, professional ethics, right? And so what's happened over the centuries is that we've retained those words, but they've lost the whole understanding that has given them their significance. So and vocation retains it a bit more. So you can usually when you're talking about calling, there's some room there, there's some space to get at. Well, what's meaningful about that to you? Professionalism and profession, I feel like it's pretty much lost that religious or spiritual undertone, which actually gave it its significance in the first place.
It almost seems like the what you're talking about there, it's two sides of the same coin. So on the one hand, it's like, how do we move away from uh, this type of, I don't even want to say care, but this way of living as a special calling
Right?
to, if you are a Christian, then this should be a a inherent part of your identity. Like, this is something that I often say is, how do we move from this being the special calling of a chosen few or a chosen, parachurch ministry or not for profit or church, or like, oh, that's the church or that's the person that's
Hmm.
their thing, and calling to actually, this is who we are as Christians. Like, it's just, of course we would do this, as if there aren't scriptures being like, hey, those people who are pushed to the margins of society and nobody cares about? Yeah, I'm them, right?
Hmm.
Right?
Hmm.
I mean, this is the who is my neighbor question, right? That, okay, love God, love people as you would yourself. And the second, right, all that. on this hang all law and prophets, and then the guy's like, well, who's my neighbor? Like that
Yeah.
is the callous question to get out of the responsibility of being the type of person who loves whoever God puts in your pathway. And of course, these are critiques that have been deployed even within like the literature in disability of there are some folks who position it more as a special calling, particularly Jean Vanier and so forth, that L'Arche and himself were sort of specially called to this. And this community is a sort of set apart community as an example to others that if you want to join, you can, but if not, that's fine too. And I think and probably my impulse is to be a bit more ambitious and say, no, we're all called. And then we may be particularly called beyond that, whether it's in this type of work, like the job that we'd go to 9 to 5. Like we're all called to love our neighbor, and that works itself out in different ways. And yeah, we have certain professions, but like this is baseline, people. Right. So that's one. Okay. The other side of that coin is what you're talking about is how do words like profession, calling, and vocation become spiritualized, but also used as management and human techniques to get more out of people and pay them less.
Hmm.
And you work through that in your book too of like, okay, so number one, let's not view this as a totally special calling that's only, a chosen few do. And also for the people who do feel specifically called to work in this area, if you're in a position of leadership and management, don't use that as the means to the ends of getting more out of them. Right. So you're pushing against like the overly spiritualized version,
Hmm.
but the also like overly commodified capitalistic co-opting of the calling and just being like, what if we just said that some people's jobs do lead them into this territory and some people don't? But in general, as the body of Christ, we take it for granted that the body should be made up of diverse members, right? And so often the move is made to just like insulate ourselves from that very basic truth. Like if
Hmm.
everybody in your church looks the same, talks the same, moves the same, wants to worship the same, or think about the stuff of God the same, or experience God the same, you probably have a problem. Right? Like, so yeah, I think that is what you're doing is really, really pressing that in your book and what you're saying here. But one of the things that you talk about is in Ontario, which is where you're situated, there was the competency framework made uh, uh, by an organization in Ontario for development services. And you made the point that behavioral competencies, as well intended as they were in that framework, often lack these theological, philosophical, and moral foundations necessary to the kind of character you need to work faithfully and healthy in a care profession. So you even go further to say that a lot of they hired that like special consulting firm or something,
Hmm.
and but the people they hired, like none of them actually, not there was very it was a very narrow representation, right, of the different perspectives and disciplines and subject matter experts that should be contributing to something like that. So can you flesh that out a little bit for me and what's going on there and what that tells us about the sort of wider, you know, landscape that we're looking at when we're looking at the type of services and institutions and so on that you're involved in and people like you.
Yeah, there's so much there. And I would say I would go a step further and say that the group that they brought in to establish the core competencies was intentionally a blank slate,
Hmm.
right? So very deliberately they came in as almost this reflective surface to kind of reflect back what are the most effective behaviors of this group. We're going to pull those all together, and then we're going to reflect them back to you to say, these are the behaviors that you should be promoting within your organizations. Now, there's a certain kind of truth to that. There's a because you pull together people who are recognized as doing really well in the field, and you can take a snapshot in time of what works well for that time. But then, as well as now, but I would say especially then, um, we were going through transformation of services. Actually, I don't know, every every year it seems to be a new transformation of services, right? New models. We recognize that some of the ways that things have been done in the past, even though they intend to get away from institutional living, actually tend to replicate them. And so you have institutional mindsets taking place in smaller and smaller communities, and you think just changing the size is going to fix the problem. Right. And so part of the problem there was that they're reflecting back these behaviors, but there is no conversation about what is good for human beings. What does flourishing look like for the people that we're working with? Right. So yeah, you can get a snapshot, but I think this is, and to make the critique a whole lot bigger, and we'll see where this goes, but this is actually my critique of kind of liberal progressivism at this moment in history, right? That there are a number of values that are held, and they're not in themselves bad values. Things like tolerance and diversity and all these kinds of values, but there is not a lot undergirding them because with tolerance, you say every viewpoint has to be equally kind of brought into this space and upheld. And Alistair McIntyre talks about each moral tradition is each kind of morality is kind of embedded in a tradition and doesn't make much sense without it, right? And so in After Virtue, he says we have all this language of virtues, but we don't have the history, we don't have the context, and so we're just throwing these words around. And I feel like that's where we find ourselves here in 2025, that we throw a bunch of words around and we say, hey, there's something good about these words, things like compassion, right? But without a deep understanding of the calling that that has on our lives, then then A, we're not going to act on it when times get tough, and B, we're not going to be able to advocate for them when another system of thought or another tradition comes along. And I would suggest that can even be a warped version of Christianity that takes other values that aren't that I would argue as a theologian are not part of what Jesus wants for our lives or communities. But it sounds deep, it sounds rich, it sounds full, it sounds like, yeah, we know what's going on because we can call on this whole tradition, even if it doesn't align with that tradition. And a system of values isn't really going to be able to confront that, right? Anyways, so I'm going to go back to just our social services for a minute. And so one of the examples there was fostering independence in others. And in a
Mm,
particular time and in a particular place, that is really important. And so Miroslav Volf talks about a kind of Catholic personality and exclusion and embrace that needs both belonging and distance, right? And so this goes back to some of what you were touching on before as well, where I am part of this work, I belong to this work, I'm invested in this work, I feel it's kind of calling for me, but you also need distance. If you're fully kind of ensconced in that world and that is your entire world, then you're actually not going to be much good to it because you don't have any kind of perspective to be able to look at, oh, actually, this is wrong. I should say no to this, even if it costs me my job, because your work or your calling is everything to you, and it's not
mhm,
something that you're willing to give up, right? And and so you need that framework that allows you to have some perspective on what you're doing, as well as this kind of engagement with your work and commitment to it. And so in the same way, with independence, people need to be able to foster the sense of independence and community, but then they also need that sense of belonging as a part of community. And sometimes it feels like maybe we go the other way as well and say everybody needs to belong. Well, that's going to look different for people depending on where they're coming from, depending on their willingness to advocate for themselves, depending on their sense of self to begin with. And so there's all these tensions at work and at play.
Hmm.
And within a space like this, if you're not able to talk about the spiritual, if you're not able to talk about the philosophical foundations, if you're not able to talk about the good life or the common good, then you're not going to be able to wrestle through those effectively. And I would suggest that in a lot of our social service systems, that's where we find ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. You see it a lot. I mean, you and I both working in ethics, whenever you read sort of competency frameworks from the different sort of governing bodies or accreditation agencies or whoever it is that's saying, okay, in order to be able to work in this area, whether it's chaplaincy or care, um or what have you, or like nursing, like here are the things that you need, like technical know-how, right? And then once you get into like behaviors and ethics, it's just like you feel bad for the people crafting those things because they're trying to like make good on the acknowledgement that if you are working in a profession where you're caring for people who are vulnerable or hurting, uh that you should be ethical. Like we all most of us
Hmm.
agree, although there is, I've read some nursing literature on this because I do some work with the nursing school at the school that I work at, and some there's been a reaction within the nursing industry be like, you know what, like it's just evidence-based practices. Like what I do outside of my time when I'm on shift has nothing to do with the way in which I practice care as a nurse. And I'm like, really? Like, is the wall that big and solid that what you do 5 minutes before you clocking in doesn't affect what you're doing when you're on the clock caring for people? Like, we're talking about evidence-based practice. Like, that's just untrue, that doesn't have anything to do with what you do. And I'm like, if you're in the position of receiving care, wouldn't you like to know that the person providing care for you is trustworthy? And yes, I want to know that my nurse or my doctor or the people that look after my children, in daycare or teach my kids at school, like I want to know that they have knowledge to do what they want to do, but I also want to be able to trust them as a person. But how do you develop? So we all kind of acknowledge that basically based on experience and, whatever background we have. But then if we don't have a common language or depth of language and thought to articulate what that looks like, all you get are these very thin sections that ultimately amount to, well, just be ethical.
Right.
And then people like you and I are like, but what is it to be ethical? Like, we don't know totally yet. We're trying to figure that out. So then you get these like strange things where it's like an agency hires somebody and wants a reference signed off on to be like, this person is ethical. Or we
Hmm.
write these elaborate sort of statements about what to do and not to do, but then it's just ignored because other values that are unwritten creep in,
Hmm.
right? And those values actually turn out to be things like hyper individualism, intolerant tolerance. The other one that you put your finger on is effectiveness or efficiency. Like, and you work with McIntyre here that just because it's efficient doesn't mean it's right. And I mean, this is right in the territory of Ellul that he would say, in a technological world or we're governed by the overriding or overdetermined value of efficiency. That's the thing that orients everything else. So yeah, maybe it'd be good to have an ethics statement, but really we want to increase efficiency. So, and then of course the independence piece fits into that, right? You need to be independent and self-actualized and able-bodied in order to become productive, and so on and so on. And then there's folks like you and I who are asking, well, what does that mean for somebody who, for all intents and purposes, will never achieve, as far as we know, or it doesn't seem like they'll be able to achieve a level of independency and productivity that reaches the very high bar set by our world. And often the implicit or explicit response you get is a shrug. It's like, you know, what are we going to do about that? So how do you navigate this tricky territory within your field of work? Like, you obviously occupy a unique position where you are in care services, it's a Christian organization, but even within Christian organizations, how many positions are carved out like yours to be attentive to these sorts of things? Because this is just my impression being kind of in this world is like, even in Christian organizations, this isn't a top priority in terms of how you employ, just given the demands of what you're dealing with in order to meet requirements and get funding and, all these sorts of things.
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a couple of things going on there. One is that I critique professionalism to an extent. I critique core competencies, but I don't deny their usefulness. So when it comes to people who view their work as a job, who are not highly engaged, who are in it for the paycheck, I don't even necessarily critique that, right? So if you're there, if you're doing your job, if you're acting according to these behaviors, and you're kind of fulfilling that, then fine. And professionalism and core competencies are also needed in order to say, actually, you're not even reaching that bar, right? You're not able to perform at the kind of level or with the ethics that we need to see here, right? And so it catches maybe people that would abuse the system or not be ethical to begin with. So it works well-ish for that. Um, but you have so many people who bring their whole selves to their work, right? I personally come from the Christian tradition. My writing is within the Christian tradition. Our organizational philosophy is within the Christian tradition. But we hire people, we work with people from across a wide variety of backgrounds and beliefs. Um, and yeah, we do hire people from across religious traditions. I remember I was in a recruitment role. This is, I guess, a couple of or a decade and a half ago, probably. I was in a recruitment role, and I had a young Muslim woman come in wanting to be hired. At the time, we only hired Christians. But she had seen our value statement. We will honor God and value people and all we do in it with all of our resources. And she said, I love that. I want to be a part of that. Right? And it was hard at the time to be able to say, actually, at this point, we're just hiring Christians. And so that changed very shortly after that. And so we find ourselves in a space where those traditions can be a great resource, a great encouragement. People can see themselves in this kind of line of calling and care. And there's a depth to that that you don't find in somebody who is just there for the paycheck. And so in my work as I teach on compassion, fatigue, grief, and loss, often this is aimed at people who really care. And and that's where you have the possibility of the greatest gift and the greatest difficulty, right? If you don't care about somebody, you're not going to care when they move on to something else or if they pass away, right? And so grief hits where there is this kind of care, where I would go so far as to say there's a kind of love, and you have to be careful about how you use that word, obviously. Um, but how do you hold that well, right? How do you hold that well in those spaces? And it does involve a belonging, a commitment to your work in the sense of calling, but it also involves a kind of distance. And we touched a bit on Luther before, and I think there's some real challenges there as well. I mean, you kind of saw it through some of the Lutheran traditions when it came to Nazi Germany and kind of just
Hmm.
following after the will of the state and kind of uh, blessing whatever the authority happens to be. But that same dynamic can take place within any kind of institution, right? Where if you see this work is meaningful, if you see this as your calling or vocation, then you may not want to make too much of a fuss, even if bad things are happening around you. And so how do we bring in both of those elements into this role? And I think you did a great job a while back of saying, yeah, there are these two kinds of tensions here, that there's the people that just disconnect and disengage entirely, right? And then there are folks who are just in it too far. And I think you can bring those worlds together if, in speaking to Christian churches again, if you have the sense that there's a what I like to call a landscape of care out there,
Mm.
right? There's a landscape of care, and there's so many parents and caregivers that are burdened, they're stressed, they're under-resourced, right? Care work is often unpaid or underpaid,
Mm.
right? And that can be for personal caregiving, that can be for professional caregiving as well. And so what does it look like for the church, for our communities to wrap themselves around and say, yeah, there is a role for me. And it might not be a full-time vocational role, it might be volunteering, it might be for us, it might be joining one of our Caris family camps, right, and having a really neat experience there. But there's a place for all of us, and that might not even be in the disability field, but hopefully it's somewhat connected to have awareness of some of those things, right? But social systems, social services, institutions, they can't they can't care. Only people can fully care, right? And so when we bring our full selves into these spaces in a good way, in a healthy way, I think that's where you see the best balance of these things.
That's really helpful. And I've actually wrestled through this from a teaching perspective insofar as I work with pastors in training or counselors in training or chaplains in training. And as someone who works in the area of theology and ethics and who can be as salty as I can be about these sorts of things, the landscape that these people are in and will continue in if they stay in those roles that they're training for, is how do you prepare them to commit to working in and on behalf of a church or a counseling practice, or a parachurch ministry, and sign on to that organization's values and ways of doing things, but also as an individual within that, within the calling that you're practicing, how do you actually take responsibility and not become passive and just say, well, I'm just supposed to do what we're supposed to do, and that's it. So sometimes it feels like such a difficult sort of way to prepare for people to get into a situation where um, they don't want to be so passive that they're actually causing harm to the people that are in their midst because they're just sort of, doing things as written. But also you also don't want to create the type of person who is totally disruptive and creating, problems every single time a little bit of their sort of sense as an individual autonomous moral agent is offended, right? So it feels sometimes like from a teaching perspective, you're sending them out there to put real theological language on there, to be pastoral and prophetic. But
Hmm.
I also know, because I've been in local church ministry, how resistant those contexts can be to people who are doing that. I think it's why I ended up in the academy, because it's like status quo doesn't work for me.
Right.
The thing that people like most is like Michael will tell him what he thinks. That gets me hired, but it also gets me like, can you leave now? Like you're always right. So you're trying to like I'm not I think like perfect balance is you can't get it. You
Hmm.
don't always get it right. And I think there's grace for that and it's part of the journey. But like this is where you touch on this quote I wrote down. You said Christian care provision must inspire employees as human beings to embrace their responsibility as moral agents who promote flourishing for all people. Precisely because care cannot be manufactured by service organizations, these agencies must foster an environment where caregivers are free to assess and make ethical decisions towards full human flourishing. In short, caregivers must be free to care. I think that puts helpful language to what we're talking about because you're not free in your caring if you're so invested you're burning yourself out and your life is blowing up at home because you're so invested in your work, you're neglecting your own family and your own health. Likewise, you're not free in your caring if you're sort of just phoning it in and doing what um is just everything by the book and missing the people in your midst, and how they may complicate or at times problematize, step one, two, three as written. Um, so how do you negotiate? Because to me, it seems a little bit like a tightrope, really. So you're in the position of trying to help people walk that tightrope. So what is that like? How do you help them walk that tightrope?
Yeah, that's the ongoing question, I think, for all of us, both individually and as organizations, as people working together. And that's also the beauty and the danger of community, isn't it? And so the title of the book is Formed Together: Mystery, Narrative, and Virtue in Christian Caregiving. And I don't know that we have time to walk through all the components of that, but in community, we we have different stories, right? And those different stories help brush up against each other and present different possibilities to us. And I think that can be a really helpful, important thing. And so if I'm working alongside somebody who's coming from a different faith tradition or just a different Christian tradition, right? They're going to have a slightly different view on the world than I do. And I can learn from that. That's again, we get back to Catholic community, what or Catholic personality, right? How do I learn from them and realize that I don't need to be so invested in my way of looking at the world that's all there is, right? And that's in some ways that's hope. If I find myself at the edge of burnout and I realize there are other possibilities, other ways of relating, other good ways of being in relationship, then that's a sense of hope. And I think hearing other stories does that. If we look at mystery, right? The understanding that I don't know everything that's going on, and
Mm,
and
mhm,
I'm
mhm,
and this side of heaven I'm not going to,
mm.
that there's always more than meets the eye. And again, if the system, if the injustice, if whatever it is just seems overwhelming, that sense of mystery or opacity, it presents possibilities of hope.
Yeah,
That the world is not mine, I am not God. And for Kierkegaard, is always and Augustine and others, it's always a sense of like coming back before God, looking at that encounter with God, or even sometimes confrontation with God, right? That's where we find our sense of our compass, our sense of identity. And so we find ourselves in when we don't know what's going on, when we can hear other stories, what does it look like to find hope and good ways of being with each other within those spaces? And sometimes that means taking a step back, because often it's pride that makes us push forward no matter the cost, right? It's pride in our own way of thinking. It has to be this way. I am making all the difference in the world. What is God going to do without me? I mean, I don't think we maybe say it that way, but sometimes this savior mentality is what makes it so crucial for me to make that difference in that person's life, right? Whereas praying about it, being with other people can remind us that it's not all about me, and maybe there are other people around that can step in and meet that need as well.
yeah. I really loved the theme of opacity throughout the book, and you touch on it there and just what you said, and it really got me thinking about how much in our current moment we want to see and approach everything as totally transparent and knowable, whether that's people or moral dilemmas or laws of nature. At this point, we tend to think individually and collectively that there's nothing that we can't make transparent with our minds, our abilities, and our technologies. And you're pushing against that and saying, as much as we think we can do that, people are opaque. If we're talking image of God, like we always want, I don't, the universal we, many people want to say that it's a capacity, and then say, oh, aha, we've nailed it down. We know what it is now. But actually, an attentive reading of Scripture and where, the arc of Scripture goes, we're saying Christ is the perfect image of God. Well, the moment that you say that a being, let alone a divine being, is the perfect image of God, well, that just became incredibly opaque. We can't penetrate it. But also, that is where the hope is that
Hmm.
there's always more to discover about the image. And it's the same with people, right? You could be married for years and still be surprised by the person you're married to, right? So if that's just the average person, think about it for the divine logos who's enfleshed, right? And so that gives us so many ways of thinking like, I don't have to know. I don't have to know. I don't have to know the inner life of that person who's nonverbal. I don't have to know whether or not they know this truth proposition about Jesus and
Right.
whether or not they have a relation with him. This like God knows. And I was thinking about this in the story of the man who is paralyzed, right? His friends lower him from the roof and Jesus takes notice. But Jesus recognizes that guy. He calls him friend, term of recognition, and then looks into him and says, "Friend, your sins are forgiven." So Jesus perceives that man's inner life without a word exchanged. How crazy is that? And how
Hmm.
many people looked at that man and be like, "Well, clearly he doesn't have a relationship with God. Clearly, I mean, this is arguing from silence, but like based on John 9, where the disciples are like, who sinned, this blind guy or his parents?" And Jesus is like, neither. You can't penetrate this mystery. Only I can.
Hmm.
And so this opens up so much territory for wonder and joy about not having to know at any given moment, the total picture of what we should be doing and who we should be doing it with and just the people and situations that we find ourselves in. And you talk about this with Kierkegaard and the incognito and, linking that back to the story of this woman who was like the first person who applied that you're like, wow, you'd be a really good candidate. You you sound like you're exactly the type of person we want, but you're not Christian, right? And for some Christians to be like, well, clearly we can't hire her. But then if you deploy an incognito hermeneutic, you're like, well, maybe this is the presence of Christ trying to do something here, you know? I I don't know, right? But so talk about the incognito and how that's at work here, how this produces all sorts of surprising, interesting moments of being like, well, we thought that this was the right way to do thing, but now this person showed up and this situation happened, and I think God might be doing something here, even though, the standard accounts would be like, well, surely God wouldn't work in this way.
Yeah, for sure. And it relates even to our conversations about professionalism and codes of ethics and how and efficiency, to be honest, where we want these things to be transparent. We want to list a criteria. Here is how we're the most efficient or effective, and this is the best way to do it. And whenever you have a best way to do it, then there are going to be people who can't or won't comply with that, right? Now, obviously, there are some ways in which you can tell somebody is not a good fit for 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 this type of work, right? Often seeing somebody interact with somebody else with a disability or differences can be a great way of getting an initial sense of how open they are to the experience. And so in recruitment, I would interview alongside somebody who had a disability, and and so I had all this whole list of questions in terms I would go through and I would assess, but sometimes I could almost just chuck that out the window when I looked at how they interacted with or treated the person beside me. For instance, if the person I was with asked a question and the applicant turned to me and answered instead of answering that person, I'm like, oh, I feel like this person might not get it. Right? They have just
Yeah.
disrespected the person actually asking the question, um, to go back to me, who they saw as like this figure of authority. And so I think there's a lot of those kinds of things that happen in our communities. And so what does it look like, to be willing to be disruptive or disrupted and experience who Christ is in our communities? And that might be in our churches, right? Where something goes horribly wrong. Well, you have to start asking questions about that. Like the person lowered through the roof, right? That's a day that has gone horribly wrong. And, and or did it? And you look back at it in scriptures, and it's a beautiful and profound truth about who Christ is, about who God is, and what He wants for us in our world. And I think we come across these moments all this time, these moments of disruption. And actually, I look to Judith Butler, who is a maybe a strange person in some ways for a Christian theologian to draw on to make a final point in these matters. But she does such a great job of kind of assessing the ways that disruption can challenge the views that we have previously held, right? If we're surprised, if we face this confrontation or this disruption that it forces us to reckon with, what is it that I was expecting? Were my expectations kind of in line with what God wants for me, or is it just the values that I have accepted from the world? And so if we're a Christian in a church community and we have never encountered somebody with disabilities in our congregation, and then we're disrupted when somebody comes in and maybe interacts. We had a person at our church, um, I think he was autistic, and he would sit up the front and he would jump in and he would like question the pastor all the time. Right. And we had this Mother's Day service. And so we were talking about mothers and how great they were and whatnot. And it's an Anabaptist service, like fairly Protestant in a lot of ways. And he just shouts out, "What about Mary?" And I loved it. Like none of us were thinking about Mary. And then all of a sudden, into this Mother's Day service, you're like, oh yeah, we probably shouldn't forget about the Mother of God, right?
So good.
Yeah.
So good.
And
Yeah.
it's not where the pastor had been intending on going, but it was just this beautiful moment. And now not all those moments are going to be that poignant, I guess, but I think there's a possibility of coming to a new understanding of who God is when we are confronted with ourselves in those kinds of moments.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Um, I love your reading of the man being lowered from the roof because I just think like the common response, if you just like map that on to your average ministry leader, if their roof is getting pulled apart so that someone can be lowered down, it's like, can't you see I'm doing important things here?
Yeah.
Or, go away, or, oh, we have a ministry for that. Like go over there. Or we know somebody in our congregation who works, go there. But no, the response of Christ is, hey, what's up, friend?
Yeah.
Right? And those moments that you talk about that often are treated as disruptions, sometimes they lead to these poignant moments, and other times they're just, as far as we can tell, a disruption. And you can't necessarily narrate it in a way that ties up in a neat bow, but even then there's a poignancy to that because you're like, that's just life. And
Yeah.
so much of the way that we gather and organize any, group, whether it's in a church or care institution or whatever, is we try to uh, iron out the bumps. We want to, flatten it out to avoid disruptions. And yet, to be human is, and to be in relationship with other humans is inherently disruptive, right?
For
And
sure.
how do we just be okay with that and not even have to narrate it? And through that, how does that form us over time, and what type of virtues does this form, right? All of this is incredibly helpful, and I could ask like 5,000 more questions, but I want to finish with one because you do also complicate, accounts of the virtues and ethics, right? And you press into this question of, okay, when we talk about the virtues and practices and habits and so on, what vision of the human do we have at the heart of that? And to what extent is the vision of the human that often is at play in the virtue ethics way of doing things is this able-bodied, autonomous, rational individual, the Enlightenment figure. Um, so in one way, you're using the virtue ethics sort of perspective, but you're also complicating it a little bit. So I want to hear you speak to this before we wind down, because I really also love that sort of strain of the book.
Right, and I have a lot of respect for virtue ethics, um, and I think there's a lot of good there, particularly in this moment of time when it feels like our values can be so shallow, when our values, whether acknowledged or not, are often things like comfort, things like efficiency, or what have you, right? I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to take stock of what's actually happening here, what are the values that drive it, and how do these relate to a life of flourishing? How do these relate to the common good? Because those questions aren't being asked. At the same time, virtue can often prioritize the intellect and rationality in ways that we just haven't thought through. And so, working in this field, working with Kierkegaard, challenges me to think through what do virtues look like if we don't prioritize that in the same way, if we don't have all the information, if we find ourselves in places of grief, just this kind of loss, which is etymologically related to that sense of care, right? So if we find ourselves in this place of unknowing or loss or brokenness or what have you, how do we come alongside each other in those times? And so I use virtues in the book, but postures might be almost more helpful here. Like how am I oriented towards another, towards my neighbor, and also towards myself, right? Because I think I am the person who's closest to me, but often I'm a stranger to myself, and I don't completely understand who I am or what drives me or um, my intentions behind things, right? And that's one of the critiques of McIntyre I have as well, is that as as we think through virtues, sometimes it relies too much on, yeah, I know what I'm doing. I know why I'm doing this. And frankly, often I don't. Often it's days later, I'm like, yeah, that was actually pretty selfish of me. I thought I was doing something good, but they might have been right. And so I talk about these virtues of care. I'll see if I remember them, but there's a quiet attentiveness, right? You don't have the answers. You don't have anything to say. How can I be here and be here for you? There's humble courage, having the courage, having the heart to move into a situation, but also acknowledging that I don't have all the answers. And so you're not coming into it as a savior with this idea of where this needs to go and I'm going to bring you there. But the problem is, if we see ourselves as not having all the answers, sometimes we just sit back and don't do anything about it. And so, how do I move into that space, move in that conversation, get to know that person, even if I'm worried I'm going to say the wrong thing? But that humility usually puts us in a good posture. Um, there's there's loving mercy, right? Uh, how do I have a kind of charity that's not what we would foresee as like a bad kind of charity that imposes on others, but is merciful in a way that respects who they are. And then this dance of confession and forgiveness as well. So I admit I don't I I I did something I might not even know why I did this thing, but I recognize the impact that it's had on you, and that need for that to ask for that forgiveness, to say, I'm kind of in your debt here, right? Not to demand that forgiveness, but to say, yeah, I need something from you. That idea of the givenness, right? How do we give ourselves to each other in a good way and also receive from each other in a good way? And so I found that was helpful in these spaces. I think it's helpful in my own life as well, as I'm tempted to think that I have all the answers or know what's going on, and come plowing into a situation and say, no, this is the way it needs to be, or this is the way you need to think, or this is what have you. How do I come in and say, what's going on here? I don't have all the answers, but I want to be here for you in a good way.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a wonderful place to end. And I think it's a very helpful starting point if we're asking the question, whatever context we're in, how do we walk that tightrope? So thank you for your work, and thank you for the time you spent sharing about it. And thank you for your witness, Keith. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. This has been a delightful, Michael. I appreciate it.
No problem.